In the silent stone corridors of a 14th-century convent, one woman dared to speak of what others died hiding. Her name was Sister Eleonora of Rouen, a nun who claimed the convent was not a sanctuary of God, but a brothel for nobles under the Church's blessing. What began as divine devotion became a chamber of forced lust, punishment, and death. Her confession, found centuries later, would expose one of the darkest intersections of faith and depravity in medieval history. In the year 1321, amid the cold stone villages of Normandy, a girl named Eleonora de Rouen was sent to a convent before her 13th birthday. Her father, a minor nobleman, could not afford a dowry for all his daughters, so one was given to God. The decision was praised as virtuous, but in truth, it was convenience disguised as faith. For Eleonora, childhood ended the moment the iron gates closed behind her. The Abbey of Saint Martine stood on a lonely hill overlooking the Seine, its walls streaked with rain and age. Inside, the nuns spoke little. They moved like shadows, their eyes hollow yet obedient. The smell of incense mixed with mold and candle wax. Silence was not devotion here, it was fear, passed from one generation of sisters to the next. Eleonora's first months were marked by strict routine, prayer, penance, fasting. The abbess, Mother Agnes of Valwoux, told her that obedience was the highest form of holiness. To question was to sin. To suffer was to purify. Yet Eleonora noticed strange things. At night, she heard footsteps echoing long after the evening bells. Some sisters returned from visits to the upper chambers trembling, their lips bitten, their habits torn. When she asked one elder sister what had happened, the woman only whispered, "Do not look where God forbids you to see." One night, Eleonora was ordered to serve at a private dinner. A nobleman, dressed in silks and bearing a jeweled cross, dined beside Mother Agnes. He smiled too easily, touching the sisters' hands as he spoke of donations to the church. After the feast, Eleonora saw two older nuns lead him through a hidden door behind the chapel. Their faces were pale, resigned, not with reverence, but with surrender. It was then she understood. This house of God was not a sanctuary. It was a marketplace. Over the next months, Eleonora's innocence eroded quietly. She scrubbed blood from linen without asking whose it was. She heard muffled cries in confessionals and the sound of keys locking iron doors. When a young novice vanished after refusing private service, Mother Agnes told the sister she had been taken to serve the Lord more directly. The others nodded, eyes downcast as if rehearsing a lie too dangerous to forget. In the cold dormitory, Eleonora began to pray not for salvation, but for clarity. She asked why God would dwell in such a place. The walls gave no answer. Only the wind through the broken glass carried her prayers away. But something within her refused to die. Late at night, when the convent slept, Eleonora began to write, first verses of scripture, then words of her own. She wrote of what she saw, what she feared, what she dared not say aloud. She hid her notes behind the altar, beneath the folds of her Bible. Her writing became her second voice, one that could not be silenced by the abbess's threats or the noble's demands. In those stolen moments, she found fragments of her lost self. Yet each word she wrote also deepened her danger. For the abbess preached that words, once spoken or written without permission, could damn a soul to eternal fire. And in that convent, silence was not merely virtue, it was survival. By the spring of 1324, whispers spread through the Abbey of Saint Martine that a great patron was coming. The sisters polished every chalice and washed the flagstones until their knuckles split. Mother Agnes announced that Duke Armand of Valwoux, cousin to the king's council, would bring generous gifts to sustain their holy mission. His arrival, she said, was the Lord's reward for obedience. When the duke's entourage thundered up the muddy path, Eleonora stood among the sisters in procession. He dismounted, perfumed and smiling, his cloak lined with crimson fur. Behind him trailed clerks and soldiers who carried casks of wine, luxuries forbidden to the sisters. Yet Mother Agnes embraced him as though greeting a bishop. She ordered music in the refectory, though no instruments were kept there. That night a feast was laid unlike any Eleonora had ever seen. Silver plates gleamed under candlelight, and the air smelled of roasted fowl and incense. The Duke toasted the convent's purity and hospitality, his words slurred with amusement. At his signal, the abbess summoned 6 young nuns to serve. Their habits had been altered, necklines lowered, veils lightened with lace. Eleonora poured his cup with trembling hands. When he touched her wrist, she felt the same chill as when she first crossed the convent gate. After the feast, Mother Agnes dismissed the older sisters. Only the youngest were told to remain for private benediction. Guards stood outside the hall as the Duke and his men removed their rings and cloaks. What followed was never written in the convent record, but Eleonora's later confession described a sanctified masquerade of sin. Where the crucifix watched, and none dared close their eyes. The Duke called it worship through flesh, the Church's reward for his generosity. By dawn, the hall stank of wine and candle wax. The Duke slept on the altar rug while the abbess counted coins from a silver chest. Eleonora helped clean the stains before matins. She was ordered to burn the linens and speak no word of the evening. The abbess reminded her, "A noble's touch is a blessing. To deny it is rebellion against Providence." In the weeks that followed, noble visitors came more often. Some wore armor still wet with blood from distant wars. Others arrived with priests who blessed their entry into God's chosen house. The abbess explained that such men ensured the abbey's survival. "Our virtue feeds their souls," she said, "and their gold feeds ours." Eleonora began to notice patterns. Each time a noble departed, 1 or 2 sisters disappeared, sent, according to the abbess, on missions of faith. Yet the dormitory beds remained stripped, and their names were scratched from the roll. No prayers were said for their journey. At Vespers, Eleonora's voice faltered as she sang. The psalms of obedience rang false in her mouth. Guilt and disbelief warred within her. Guilt for questioning, disbelief for what God allowed. She confessed her confusion to the priest who served the abbey, an old man who kept his eyes fixed on the floor. "Child," he whispered, "the church is vast. There are rooms within rooms. Some doors should never be opened." That night, Eleonora wrote again more urgently, her ink smudged with tears. She described every noble's face she could recall, the songs the abbess ordered them to sing, the gold exchanged for silence. She hid the parchment behind a loose stone in her cell. She no longer prayed for forgiveness. She prayed for witness. For the first time, she understood that sin did not always dwell in the sinner's heart. It could wear a rosary and speak the language of salvation. And in the Abbey of St. Martine, salvation had a price measured in flesh. By the time Eleonora turned 16, she had learned the first rule of survival: obedience was safer than virtue. In the Abbey of St. Martine, disobedience was not punished with words, it was erased. Every morning began with confession, where each sister knelt before Mother Agnes to recount the smallest doubts. To hesitate or forget was to invite suspicion. A soul that hides even a single sin, the abbess said, is a soul that invites the devil into God's house. Her voice was soft, yet her punishments left bruises darker than any sermon. Eleonora's confessions grew mechanical. She repeated phrases she no longer believed, that she was grateful, that she was pure, that she loved her service. Behind her mask of devotion, she observed everything. The older nuns were silent, their bodies thin and scarred. Some bore strange brands near their collarbones, marks Eleonora recognized from the Duke's rings. They never spoke of them. The church bells rang differently after a noble's visit. The usual pattern of prayer was replaced by a low, prolonged toll, followed by fasting. Those days, the abbess forbade all speech. The corridors filled with the shuffle of feet and the rustle of skirts. as if the convent itself held its breath. When one young novice refused to attend a special audience, she vanished before sunrise. The abbess gathered the sisters and announced that the girl had been taken by fever, yet Eleonora had seen her dragged toward the lower crypt. That night, the bells rang 12 times. No fever was ever mentioned again. Eleonora's hidden writings multiplied. She described how sin was repainted as sacrifice, how suffering was sanctified when performed for noble eyes. Her words were a mirror she feared to face, but could not turn away from. She wrote by moonlight, scratching her quill so softly that even the rats paused to listen. The convent's priest, Father Guillaume, began to notice her exhaustion. He asked why she looked pale, and Eleonora nearly told him everything. But his trembling hands betrayed him. He already knew. His silence was not ignorance, but complicity. "Do not fight what you cannot change," he murmured. "This place has survived because it serves power, not God." The next week, Eleonora was summoned to the abbess's chamber. There, she found a table spread with coins, parchment, and a gilded crucifix. The abbess smiled gently. "Our noble patrons speak highly of you," she said. "You are obedient, quiet, and pleasing to the Lord. Continue in this grace, and the convent will prosper." It was not a command, it was a warning. Eleonora bowed her head, but her mind burned. She realized that obedience was no longer faith, it was currency. And every act of silence she offered bought her one more day of safety. She began to pray differently, no longer asking for mercy, but for strength to remember. She understood that the church's holiness was not destroyed by heresy from without, but by rot from within. When another noble's feast was announced, Eleonora hid her writings in 3 separate places: under her bed, behind the altar, and within a sealed jar in the herb room. If she was taken, the truth would remain somewhere the abbess could not reach. That night, she knelt in her cell, whispering a final prayer. "If obedience is holy, then let my disobedience bear witness." The candlelight flickered, and for the first time since her arrival, Eleonora did not fear the darkness. By 1327, the Abbey of St. Martine had grown quieter, not with peace, but with dread. The nuns spoke only when commanded, their eyes fixed on the floor. In the stillness of prayer, Eleonora began to sense that beneath the stone chapel lay more than crypts of the dead. There was a smell that never faded, dampness mixed with something foul, like decay trapped in the walls. One evening, the abbess ordered Eleonora to assist in penitential care. 2 guards led her to a locked stairway behind the chapel. The air grew colder with each step downward. At the base, torchlight revealed a narrow corridor lined with iron doors. Faint sounds drifted from within, whimpers, prayers, and the rasp of chains. "This is the chamber of silence," the abbess said. "Here dwell those who disobeyed God's order." Inside one cell, a woman lay on straw, her skin marked with burns. She whispered through cracked lips, "Don't forget us." When Eleonora tried to give her water, the abbess struck her hand and said, "Mercy weakens judgment." They left the woman to die. Eleonora was forbidden to speak of what she had seen. But that night, she could not sleep. She dreamed of the locked doors, of voices calling from beneath the floorboards during Mass. The next day, she stole a key from the laundry and returned to the chamber. By torchlight, she opened one cell and found another nun, already gone, her fingers curled around a rosary eaten by rust. Scratched into the wall above her head were words barely legible, "Sanctity through pain." Eleonora fell to her knees. Every story the abbess had told about holy penance, every promise of purification, it was all carved in this darkness. These were not sinners. They were witnesses erased by the same church that preached salvation. She began documenting everything. On thin scraps of parchment, she described each cell, each mark of torture, each prayer muttered in madness. She hid her writings within hollow candle bases and beneath loose stones. Her quill became a weapon sharper than any blade. Weeks later, a heavy snow sealed the convent from the outside world. The dead were buried beneath the chapel floor, their graves unmarked. When she was sent again to clean the chamber, Eleonora found the woman she'd seen before, now lifeless, her lips frozen in the shape of a prayer. Eleonora took a small cross from her body and hid it beneath her robe. It was the only mercy she could offer. That night, she overheard two servants whisper that the Duke had ordered more offerings. The abbess replied coldly, "There are still bodies that breathe." Eleonora realized then that the chamber would never empty. It would fill endlessly, one obedient soul at a time. When she returned to her cell, she pressed the cross to her chest and wrote, "If this is silence, let it echo until the end of time." Her handwriting trembled, but her resolve did not. She knew the chamber of silence was not meant to punish sin, it was meant to bury truth. And the only sin left was remembering. By midsummer of 1328, the Abbey of St. Martine prepared for an event unlike any before. A royal envoy announced that the Marquis of Blois, a cousin to the Duke, would visit with his retinue to celebrate a new alliance between noble houses. Mother Agnes declared the occasion a sacred banquet to honor divine favor. The sisters were ordered to fast for 3 days, to appear pale and humble, pleasing to noble eyes. Eleonora sensed dread behind every smile. She had seen what followed noble feasts. The kitchens filled with meat and wine, forbidden luxuries for those who had taken vows of poverty. Tailors arrived with chests of fabric, instructing the younger nuns to fit themselves in grace. When Eleonora tried to refuse the silk garment given to her, the abbess leaned close and whispered, "To deny this is to deny God's blessing." On the evening of the feast, the chapel was transformed. Candles glowed from every corner, gilded icons gleamed, and the crucifix was draped in crimson cloth. The nobles dined where mass was usually held. Gold chalices overflowed with spiced wine. Music echoed through the nave, played by men who had never seen the inside of a church before. Eleonora poured for the Marquis, her eyes fixed on the table to avoid his gaze. Around her, laughter grew louder, less human. Toasts to holiness became jokes about divine appetite. When one nun hesitated to refill a cup, the abbess struck her before the nobles, then laughed as if it were part of the entertainment. As night deepened, the wine turned to frenzy. The nobles demanded a dance of purity. The abbess, smiling thinly, ordered 6 sisters to step forward. The music slowed to a rhythm too heavy for prayer. Eleonora felt her stomach twist as the Marquis reached for her hand. She did not resist, not from acceptance, but from terror that any defiance would condemn another in her place. In her later writings, Eleonora would call that night the Feast of Blood. She described it not as a single act, but as a ritual, sacred symbols desecrated, hymns twisted into mockery, bodies treated as offerings upon a silent altar. The candles burned low, and their wax dripped like tears onto the stone floor. At dawn, the nobles departed, leaving behind the smell of wine, sweat, and incense. The abbess ordered every trace of the banquet destroyed, the linens burned, the chalices cleansed, the floor scrubbed with salt water. Yet the stones beneath Eleonora's hands seemed to pulse with what had been done there. She spent that day writing in secret, her words shaking with exhaustion and fury. "We sang hymns while devils wore crowns. They called us brides of Christ, yet sold our bodies as proof of devotion. If this is holiness, then hell must be merciful." When the abbess discovered her absence from morning prayer, Eleonora claimed sickness. She hid her writings inside the hollow of an old prayer stool, sealing them with wax. That night, rain lashed the convent. Eleonora knelt before the small wooden cross she had taken from the dead sister in the chamber of silence. For the first time, she prayed not for deliverance, but for revelation, that the truth might one day surface, even if it buried her with it. Outside, thunder rolled across the valley, shaking the bell tower. Within its echo, Eleonora swore a vow. If the church would not remember the sins of men, she would. And she would write until the walls themselves bore witness. 2 weeks after the feast, silence hung over the abbey like a burial shroud. The nobles were gone, the torches extinguished, and the halls reeked of vinegar and incense, the scent of cleansing. But whispers traveled faster than prayer. Some sisters had vanished without farewell. Others walked like ghosts, their eyes hollow, their lips trembling when they mouthed the creed. Eleonora continued her secret writings, recording the names of those who disappeared. She hid her notes inside the walls of the scriptorium, beneath layers of plaster softened by candle heat. Her confessions were not born of rebellion. They were an act of remembrance, of preserving the truth before it was erased by obedience. But truth, in a holy house ruled by power, was treason. One dawn, while she tended the herb garden, 2 guards entered the courtyard. They carried no weapons, only a folded parchment sealed in wax. The abbess followed behind, her face serene as stone. The parchment bore a decree from the Bishop of Bourges. A sister is accused of pride and heresy for claiming to record the sins of the holy. Eleonora's heart stilled. The abbess' eyes met hers. That night, she was taken to the chamber of purification, a small cell beneath the chapel, its walls lined with iron hooks and rosaries. The bishop's inquisitor awaited her there, Father Guillaume, a man whose sermons once praised humility, now acting as judge and executioner. He asked her 3 questions, each delivered in a tone of false mercy. Did you write these words? Do you believe the convent has sinned? Will you repent before the eyes of the Lord? Eleonora answered truthfully to the first, hesitated on the second, and was silent on the third. Her silence was her sentence. She was stripped of her veil, her hair cut, not by the abbess, but by one of the novices she had once comforted. As the scissors scraped against her scalp, Eleonora whispered, "Do not look away. Remember this." The girl wept but obeyed. Father Guillaume ordered her confined without food or water for 3 days, a test of repentance. On the second night, delirious from thirst, she carved words into the wall with a broken piece of pottery. Truth burns even when spoken softly. The abbess visited her on the 3rd day. She carried bread and a chalice of water, mercy she claimed. But Eleonora refused to eat. Her body trembled with weakness, yet her eyes remained unbroken. The abbess spoke gently, almost kindly. "You have written poison, child. The world does not need your truth. It needs faith." Eleonora replied, her voice no louder than a whisper. "Faith without truth is a lie that kills the soul." It was enough. The abbess left without another word. The next morning, the bishop's decree was read aloud before the sisters. Eleonora was to be transferred to the Abbey of Saint Rene, a place known not for healing, but for silence. Those who went there never returned. Before her departure, she was permitted to pray one last time in the chapel. She knelt before the altar where the feast of blood had been held. The candles flickered, as if remembering. She pressed her hands to the cold stone and murmured, "Let these walls remember me, if no one else will." When the guards led her away, no sister dared to look up. Only one, the youngest novice, whispered after her, trembling, "Forgive us, Sister Eleonora." Eleonora did not turn back. She had already forgiven them. It was the church she could not. By the spring of 1348, the road to Saint Rene Abbey reeked of rot and fear. The Black Death had swept across France, devouring towns and monasteries alike. Villages lay silent, fields untended, carts filled with corpses rolled towards shallow graves. The church called it divine punishment. The people called it the end of the world. Eleonora arrived at Saint Rene weak, half-starved, yet alive. The convent was smaller than Saint Martine, older, colder, its stones blackened by dampness and smoke. Only 12 sisters remained. The rest had fled or died. The abbess of Saint Rene, a woman named Sister Marguerite, greeted her with trembling hands and hollow eyes. "Here," she whispered, "we pray for mercy, not forgiveness." The plague had already entered their walls. At first, Eleonora was kept in isolation. She was ordered to copy psalms, to cleanse her soul through ink and silence. But the screams of dying nuns echoed through the corridors, drowning every prayer. The air thickened with the stench of sickness and burning herbs. The bells tolled day and night, though no one remained strong enough to pull the rope. When the first corpse blackened and burst before the altar, Marguerite declared that sin had infected their holy ground. The sisters began a ritual cleansing, scrubbing the walls with vinegar, burning the bedding, reciting penitential litanies until their throats bled. Some cut their own flesh with thorns, believing pain would purify them. Others whispered confessions of forbidden acts that no priest would ever absolve. Eleonora saw madness taking root where faith once lived. She tried to nurse the sick with what herbs remained, using linen torn from her own robes. She recorded their final words in secret, writing their confessions beside her own. "If no one survives," she wrote, "let these pages prove that we were human." One night, Sister Marguerite collapsed before the crucifix, blood seeping from her nose. With her last breath, she gasped, "The Lord's cleansing fire is upon us." When she died, the surviving sisters panicked. They sealed the chapel, nailed the doors shut, and burned incense until the smoke suffocated two of them in their sleep. Eleonora alone kept calm. She gathered the dead, one by one, and laid them in the courtyard beneath the rain. She prayed not for salvation, but for remembrance. "They feared God," she murmured, "but it was men who made them suffer." On the 12th day, the plague reached her. Fever twisted her body. Her vision blurred. She dragged herself to the scriptorium, the one place untouched by fire, and placed her manuscript on the lectern. She knew she would not finish it. Her final entry was brief, trembling yet unyielding. "If these words survive, let them cleanse the lies, not the souls." When dawn came, travelers found the convent silent. Inside, the bodies of the sisters lay in rows, their hands folded over wooden crosses. In the scriptorium, Eleonora was found seated upright, her ink-stained fingers frozen around a quill. Before her, the parchment still glistened wet. The villagers burned the abbey to prevent contagion, yet one monk from Bourges rescued a small bundle of writings from the ashes, the manuscript that would later be called the Confession of Saint René. In its pages he read of hunger, devotion, humiliation, and a faith that rotted under power. He noted in the margin, "These are not the words of a heretic, but of one who saw truth too clearly." Centuries would pass before anyone spoke her name again. But the walls of Saint René, charred and broken, would always whisper it. Eleonora. Decades after the plague turned the abbey to ash, the church rediscovered Eleonora's writings. It was 1372 when a Dominican inquisitor named Father Etienne du Lys stumbled upon a soot-stained bundle of vellum in the archives of Bourges Cathedral. The script was faint, the ink rusted brown, but the words still breathed. The Confession of Saint René. At first, Etienne believed it to be a forged chronicle, a madwoman's ramblings written during the pestilence. But as he read deeper, he found no heresy of faith, only the anatomy of corruption, how the holy had become cruel, how obedience had been sold as salvation. He should have burned it. Instead, he preserved it and sealed it in the inquisitorial records, marked with one word, dangerous. The discovery spread through the clerical courts. Some saw the manuscript as the ravings of a tormented nun. Others feared it revealed too much about the church's buried sins. The Bishop of Tours ordered a posthumous trial, a spectacle meant to reaffirm authority, to condemn the dead woman's name, and in doing so, erase her truth forever. Thus began the trial of the damned. Witnesses were summoned, priests who had never met her, scribes who had only heard the whispers. Before the tribunal, They read excerpts aloud. The words echoed in the hall like a curse. Faith without truth is a lie that kills the soul. The bishop slammed his fist upon the table. Blasphemy, he declared. Yet even the scribes averted their eyes. There was something in the tone of her writing that felt less like rebellion and more like revelation. In the audience sat Etienne, silent, torn between duty and conscience. He knew the church would not allow her words to exist, not because they were false, but because they were too true. Over 3 days, the tribunal dissected her confessions, twisting them into accusations. They claimed Eleonora had consorted with demons, that her visions of decay were the product of witchcraft, not witness. The plague, they argued, had been her punishment. Each argument felt rehearsed, hollow, like a ritual already decided. On the final day, the verdict was read. Sister Eleonora of Saint Marthine is hereby condemned as a heretic and apostate. Her writings shall be destroyed. Her name erased from holy record. Outside the cathedral, a pyre was built. The vellum pages were tied with hemp cord and placed upon the flames. The crowd murmured prayers, unsure whether they burned sin or truth. But Etienne hesitated. In the shadows, he concealed one surviving fragment, a torn leaf bearing Eleonora's final words. He hid it beneath the lining of his robe, risking his life for a woman long dead. Years later, when Etienne lay dying in a monastery cell, he confessed to another friar what he had done. The fragment was found sealed in wax, bearing Eleonora's trembling handwriting. Let my words be judged not by the church, but by time. Truth will always rise from the ashes of power. The friar who received it refused to surrender the fragment. Instead, he placed it in a small chest, hidden beneath the altar of St. Rene's ruins. Centuries passed. Empires fell. The church changed and the memory of the trial faded into dust. But when the ruins of St. Rene were excavated in 1791, during the French Revolution, the fragment surfaced again, its ink faint yet legible. And for the first time in 400 years, the world read her name without fear. Eleonora of Saint Marthine, the nun they damned, the woman who wrote the truth. In the autumn of 1791, as revolution tore through France, a band of scholars and priests arrived at the ruins of St. Rene Abbey. The revolution had decreed the dissolution of all monastic estates. Relics were to be seized, archives catalogued, symbols of feudal power erased. Yet amid the rubble and ash, the scholars found something different, something the centuries had failed to bury. In the base of a crumbling altar, wrapped in layers of linen blackened by soot, they uncovered a small chest sealed with wax. Inside lay the fragment of Eleonora's confession, its ink faded but words still visible. The parchment smelled faintly of smoke and age. On its edge in fragile Latin, it read, "To those who still believe in mercy." Historians debated its origin. Some dismissed it as apocryphal. Others recognized the handwriting from other monastic records. But one thing was certain, it spoke in the voice of a woman who had lived through torment with the clarity of witness, not imagination. By 1793, copies of the confession circulated secretly among revolutionary thinkers. To the radicals, Eleonora was not a heretic, but a martyr of conscience, a woman who had seen the corruption of sacred power centuries before the people rose to destroy it. To the church, however, her re-emergence was a wound reopened. A Vatican scholar, reading the text in private, wrote a single line in his journal, "If her sin was truth, then we have sinned by silence." In the years that followed, the document traveled through libraries, wars, and fires. Parts were lost to looters, others preserved by archivists who never knew her name. Yet the legend of the Neon of the Burning Abbey grew in whispers, a ghostly voice that haunted the conscience of faith itself. By the 19th century, Eleonora's story became the subject of academic inquiry. Historians traced the convent of St. Marthine, the noble patronage of Blois, and the inquisitorial records of Bourges. Each new discovery confirmed that the tale once dismissed as myth had roots in fact. One scholar, Dr. Henry Valois, described her work as the first female moral testimony against ecclesiastical tyranny. He called her writings a sacred rebellion not against God, but against those who used his name to sanctify cruelty. In modern times, her name appeared briefly in university lectures and monastic studies, but never in official canon. The Church never revoked her condemnation. Her sainthood, if one could call it that, existed only in the quiet hearts of those who saw her not as defiant, but as devout beyond endurance. In 1978, a small marble plaque was placed in the ruins of Saint René by a group of historians and nuns. It bore a single inscription, translated from her own words, "I wrote so the walls would remember." Today, the abbey stands as little more than stones and moss, a hollow shell echoing the prayers of the dead. Yet when the wind passes through its arches, locals say it hums faintly, like the turning of a page. Eleonora's confession remains one of the few surviving personal testimonies of a medieval woman against the corruption of her order. Her name, once erased from history, is now read aloud in the halls of scholars who study the shadowed truths of faith. And though no church ever canonized her, she achieved something rarer: remembrance. She became what she once prayed to be, a voice that time could not silence, a witness against the cruelty of the holy. Eleonora of Saint Martine, the nun who wrote the truth in blood and ink,